Hey friends, tonight we begin with how families struggled to live in the Soviet Union. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. The story of life in the Soviet Union is not only about leaders, revolutions, and ideologies, but also about the quiet struggles of ordinary families who tried to make their way through a system that dictated every aspect of their existence. To understand what family life was like, one has to picture the daily rhythm of ordinary people workers, parents, and children who lived not in palaces or party headquarters, but in cramped apartments, long communal corridors, and villages that seemed locked in a different time. Imagine for a moment that you are there. The year is the late 1950s, though it could just as easily be the 1960s, the 1970s, or even the early 1980s. The streets outside are lined with grey apartment blocks, concrete walls stretching in unbroken rows, all built in the same style, square and utterly unremarkable. This was not architecture meant to inspire awe. It was architecture meant to house as many people as possible, as quickly as possible. Families were moved into these blocks from older wooden houses or shared communal apartments, and while the new flats promised modern comforts, they also carried new problems. Inside one of these apartments, a family of 4 tries to settle into their morning routine. The father is already awake. He works in a factory, and his shift begins early. He rises from a narrow bed, careful not to wake the youngest child, who shares the same room. There is little privacy. Thin walls do not conceal noise, and even within the family, there are no private bedrooms, as one might expect elsewhere. Every space is shared, and every object has to serve more than one purpose. The mother wakes next, moving quickly but quietly. She has a long list of tasks to manage before the day even begins. Preparing breakfast, packing something for her husband to take to work, and checking on her children. She knows that food will be simple, because supplies are limited. A slice of black bread, perhaps spread with margarine if they have it, and maybe a hard-boiled egg or some porridge if she has been lucky at the store. Tea is poured into small glasses held in metal cup holders. The smell of boiled water, faintly scented with tea leaves, fills the kitchen. It is not the lavish breakfast of other nations. It is functional, sufficient to provide energy, and nothing more. As the father eats quickly, he thinks about the long queue that his wife will stand in later that day. Queues are part of life here. To shop in the Soviet Union is not a simple matter of walking in, choosing what one needs, and paying. It is often a process of waiting, hoping, and improvising. Word spreads quickly in the neighborhood whenever a store receives something rare, perhaps bananas from abroad, or fresh meat, or butter. When that happens, lines form immediately, stretching down the street, and people join them whether they need the item or not, because one never knows when such a product will appear again. The children are stirring now, slowly waking under heavy blankets. Their clothes are simple, often handed down from older relatives. Shoes are repaired many times before being replaced, and winter coats may be worn for several years, patched and adjusted to fit as the child grows. For them, school is a central part of life. Not only do they learn mathematics, literature, and science, but they are also shaped by the ideology that surrounds them. Portraits of Lenin hang in classrooms. Red banners remind them of their duty to the motherland, and lessons often blend history with political instruction. When the father leaves for the factory, he joins a stream of men and women walking together in silence. The air is cold, breath rising in little clouds, and footsteps echo against the concrete. The factory looms large ahead, a building of steel and glass where machines roar and workers perform the same tasks day after day. For him, life is measured, not in personal achievements, but in quotas: how much steel is produced, how many parts are completed, how close his team comes to the target set by planners in distant offices back at home. The mother begins her own day. Her work is equally demanding, though often unpaid. She scrubs, washes, cooks, and shops, moving constantly to keep the household in order. If she also has a job, her day is even longer. Many women in the Soviet Union worked outside the home, often in offices, schools, or factories, and then returned to take care of their families. The idea of women staying at home was not widely encouraged. Everyone was expected to contribute to the collective effort of building socialism. When she leaves the apartment to buy groceries, she carries a reusable net bag, because plastic shopping bags are rare and precious. Outside, she finds the line already forming in front of the store. People stand quietly, chatting in low voices, waiting for the doors to open. Sometimes the line moves quickly, sometimes it does not move at all. On days when there is little to buy, frustration builds, but people rarely complain openly. Complaining is risky in a society where words can be overheard and repeated. Walls of the Soviet Union were not only made of concrete, they were also made of suspicion. For families, this suspicion was always present. Neighbors might listen too closely. A careless remark about shortages, leaders, or policies could bring trouble. Parents taught their children not to repeat conversations from home at school, because one never knew how a teacher might interpret them. Survival was not only about finding enough food and clothing, it was also about navigating a world where silence and caution were necessary. Evenings in the apartment are crowded. The father returns tired, his face lined with exhaustion from the noise and pace of the factory. The children finish their homework under the dim light of a single bulb. The family eats together. The meal: simple potatoes, cabbage soup, perhaps a little meat stretched into the dish. Dessert is rare, often reserved for holidays, when the table might hold something sweet like fruit preserves or homemade cake. After dinner, the family might sit together listening to the radio, which broadcasts both music and political news. Television is less common in the earlier decades, though by the 1970s and 1980s, more households acquire one. Still, programming is limited, and much of it is official speeches, cultural programs, or carefully approved entertainment. Families take comfort in music, literature, and occasional moments of humor, but always within the framework allowed. For the children, bedtime is early. They sleep in shared beds or narrow cots, blankets pulled tight against the cold drafts that creep through window frames. For the parents, bedtime comes later, after chores are finished and the household is quiet. They talk softly, sometimes about dreams of the future, sometimes about worries they cannot share with anyone else. Their struggles are private, lived in the small space of their apartment, carried silently from one day to the next. This is how families in the Soviet Union lived, not in dramatic headlines or historic speeches, but in daily routines of work, shortages, caution, and quiet resilience. Every loaf of bread, every warm coat, every safe night together represented small victories against a system that asked for much, but gave back only enough to survive. The heart of family struggle in the Soviet Union was not only in the scarcity of goods, but in the rhythm of life shaped by that scarcity. Every day began with calculations. What was left in the pantry, what could be stretched, what might be found at the shop, and how to make sure children had enough energy to keep up with school and chores. Mothers became mathematicians of necessity, balancing calories, rubles, and the unpredictable availability of food. Picture a kitchen shelf lined with jars of pickled vegetables, cabbages stored for the winter, and potatoes piled in sacks. These were not luxuries, but lifelines. Preservation was a tradition and a survival strategy. Families spent long autumn days boiling jars, sealing lids, and filling cellars with whatever produce they could gather. Apples, cucumbers, beets, and tomatoes, all carefully salted or sweetened for the cold months ahead. The act was not simply domestic. It was essential insurance against empty store shelves during February or March, when supplies often thinned to almost nothing. Fathers, too, found themselves improvising to keep the household going. While their official wages were paid regularly, money alone did not guarantee access to what was needed. The joke often told was that in the Soviet Union, people pretended to work, and the government pretended to pay them. But the deeper truth was that wages had limited meaning when goods were absent. Families relied on connections, favors, and exchanges as much as on rubles. A factory worker who had access to spare materials might trade them with a farmer for fresh eggs or milk. Someone who worked in a bakery might quietly save loaves for friends. A driver might bring home something rare from another town. Survival was not just about labor. It was about networks of trust in a society where trust was scarce. Children absorbed this reality quickly. They learned that when their parents told them to be quiet in public about what the family had or lacked, it was not simply parental worry, but genuine fear. A child who mentioned at school that their parents grumbled about shortages might attract unwanted attention, and so children became guardians of family secrets, trained in silence at an early age. The home itself often became a workshop of adaptation. A broken appliance could not easily be replaced, so fathers tinkered endlessly, using spare wires, screws, and tape to keep radios, lamps, and refrigerators running years past their intended lifespan. Mothers mended socks until fabric grew thin, as gauze then cut the material into rags for cleaning. Old coats became hand-me-downs, patched and repatched until their shape was barely recognizable. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could be wasted in the evenings. After the day's work, the apartment filled with a kind of weary warmth. Families often gathered around the kitchen table, the true heart of the Soviet home. The table was where children studied, where neighbors visited, where meals were shared, and where quiet laughter softened the hardness of the outside world. The food upon it was simple borscht, made from beets, cabbage soup known as shi, boiled potatoes, or kasha porridge. If a holiday approached, there might be something more festive: dumplings, fish, or a cake. Every bite was made to last. Every ingredient stretched as far as possible. Yet for all its hardships, family life also carried a certain intimacy. Families leaned on one another because they had no choice. The bonds forged in scarcity were strong. Parents worked tirelessly to shield their children from the full weight of struggle. They told them stories, read books aloud, or played simple games after dinner. Evenings might end with songs, folk melodies sung softly before bed, or with the crackling of a radio program that transported listeners, for a moment, out of their narrow apartments into the wider world. Still, even in these private hours, the state was never far away. Propaganda crept into the household through posters on walls, broadcasts on radios, and lessons repeated in schools. Children learned slogans about hard work and loyalty to the motherland. They joined the pioneers, the youth organization, and wore red scarves with pride, even if their parents privately rolled their eyes at the ceremonies. Parents had to balance their personal frustrations with the public image of support, because to be seen as disloyal was to risk jobs, safety, or worse. There were moments of joy, of course, because people find ways to celebrate even in the harshest conditions. A birthday meant gathering friends, rearranging scarce food into a semblance of a feast, and pouring small glasses of vodka for adults. New Year's Eve, more than Christmas, became the great family holiday, with a tree, gifts, and special dishes. These occasions reminded families that life was more than survival, that even within restrictions, love and festivity could endure. But the shadow of struggle always returned. Heating in winter was unreliable, and families sometimes huddled in one room to conserve warmth. Electricity outages plunged homes into darkness, and candles became a quiet necessity. The sound of dripping pipes or the hiss of a leaky radiator filled the night. Children coughed through cold seasons, wrapped in layers, while mothers prayed that the doctor's office would have medicine, and fathers searched for spare firewood or coal. In this cycle, queues, shortages, repairs, and small celebrations lay the rhythm of ordinary life. Families endured not with grand gestures, but with patience, persistence, and the quiet courage of making do. To outsiders, their existence might seem bleak. To them, it was simply life. And in their kitchens, bedrooms, and shared courtyards, the unrecorded history of the Soviet Union unfolded not in speeches or decrees, but in the daily struggle of families who survived because they refused to give up. If the Soviet home was the nucleus of survival, the orbit around it was the courtyard and the neighbors who lived only a thin wall away. Life in the communal apartment Kommunorka was a shared existence, both intimate and exhausting. Families were crammed together in long hallways lined with doors, each one leading to a single room that served as bedroom, living room, and sometimes kitchen. The true kitchen was usually communal, as was the bathroom, the laundry sink, and the lines strung with drying clothes. Privacy was rare. Voices carried through thin walls, arguments overheard, secrets half exposed. A child's cry could wake the entire floor. Neighbors fought over stove space, over who left dishes unwashed, over whose turn it was to mop the hallway. Yet at the same time, they became unchosen relatives. When a loaf of bread appeared, pieces were shared. When vodka was poured, a glass was often passed around. If a mother fell ill, another woman might watch the children. A constant push and pull of frustration and solidarity defined communal living. For children, the courtyard outside became their world. These courtyards, ringed by grey apartment blocks, doubled as playgrounds. Wooden benches served as gathering points for gossiping grandmothers who watched children dart between swings, makeshift soccer goals, and games of tag. Boys carved sticks into pretend swords, imagining themselves as heroes of old battles, while girls played clapping games or pretended to run households of their own. The games were simple, born of imagination rather than toys, but laughter echoed against the concrete all the same. But children's laughter existed alongside the state's presence. Schools drilled ideology as much as arithmetic. Classrooms displayed portraits of Lenin and Stalin. History lessons glorified the revolution and glossed over its costs. Young children joined the young pioneers, pledging loyalty to the motherland in ceremonies that blended patriotism with ritual. For many, the pioneer scarf, a bright red triangle tied neatly at the throat, was a badge of honor, a sign they were part of something greater. Yet families sometimes viewed it as a burden, another expectation to fulfill, another way the state reached into their homes. Daily life was shaped by the ritual of the queue. Few things symbolized Soviet family life more than standing in line. Women queued before dawn for bread or meat, often with children in tow. In winter, their breath rose in white clouds as they stamped their feet against the cold, inching forward hour by hour. There was no guarantee that what they sought would remain by the time they reached the counter. Still, people waited, trading gossip, sharing rumors about which store might have flour or butter that week. Some families kept queue partners, friends, or neighbors who would stand in line together, holding each other's place when necessary. The system was informal, born of necessity, a survival tactic in itself. Holidays provided brief reprieves from the grind. On May Day, families gathered for parades, children clutching balloons, fathers lifting sons onto their shoulders to see the marching bands and banners. The state orchestrated these events as displays of unity and power, but families experienced them as outings, excuses to dress up, and moments of shared pride. New Year's remained the most beloved holiday, with a decorated fir tree, gifts carefully saved or crafted, and dishes that were otherwise rare, salads with mayonnaise, oranges, imported in small quantities, perhaps even a bottle of champagne. Children waited eagerly for Dead Moros, Grandfather Frost, who brought gifts on New Year's Eve for a night. Homes glowed with warmth and abundance, even if the illusion was temporary. Inside households, gender roles were both traditional and stretched thin. Mothers bore the brunt of household management, from cooking and cleaning to queuing and childcare. Fathers often worked long shifts in factories, on construction sites, or in offices, yet their wages did not shield them from the same struggles. Some men found solace in vodka, a cheap escape that sometimes left families with even greater burdens. Alcoholism was a shadow across many Soviet homes, fraying relationships and draining resources. But many fathers also played with their children, carved toys from scraps of wood, or read them stories at night, their tired voices carrying the weight of both duty and love. Grandparents were central figures in many families. Pensioners had time to queue when younger adults could not, and they often provided stability for children when parents were working. They passed down folk tales, songs, and fragments of pre-revolutionary traditions that the state had tried to erase. Around kitchen tables, grandmothers whispered stories of Tsarist times, of wars survived, of hardships endured long before the present ones. These stories gave children a sense of continuity, of a world beyond the slogans on school posters, and yet there was always fear, the quiet, unspoken kind. Families taught children to keep their thoughts private, to avoid repeating complaints overheard at home. A careless word about shortages, about frustration with the party, or about a neighbor could have consequences. Children learned young that what was said inside the apartment did not always belong outside. Trust was rationed as carefully as bread. Parents smiled in public meetings, attended parades, and nodded at slogans, while privately sighing as they calculated whether the winter potatoes would last. Despite the struggles, small joys persisted. A letter arriving from a distant relative, bringing news of life in another city. A trip to the cinema, where families sat in darkened theaters, watching films that carried them, however briefly, out of their daily concerns. A summer picnic in the countryside, where baskets of boiled eggs, bread, and cucumbers felt like abundance under the open sky. Life was not only hardship, it was also resilience, the ability to create warmth from very little, laughter from scarcity, and meaning from struggle. The heart of the story, always, was survival. Families did not thrive in the modern sense, but they endured. They endured through queues and shortages, through cramped housing and unreliable utilities, through the ever-present watch of the state. And in their endurance, they forged bonds that carried them forward. Parents carried the weight of worry so their children could still laugh. Children carried the torch of hope so their parents could still believe in a better future. In the rhythm of the Soviet family, survival was not only necessity, was a quiet form of resistance, a way of saying, we will live, no matter how hard it is made for us. If there was one unspoken rule of Soviet life, it was this: survival meant bending the rules. Officially, the state promised to provide everything: housing, food, education, medical care. In reality, the gap between promises and reality was wide. Families learned to navigate that gap through networks, side hustles, and a constant balancing act between legality and necessity. The black market was not an exotic underworld. It was woven into daily life, a shadow economy that touched nearly every family. It might begin with something as simple as a pair of shoes. Official stores stocked only a few models, often in limited sizes, and shoes wore out quickly. A neighbor might whisper about someone who had connections and could get better ones, perhaps imported from the East or acquired through unofficial channels. Payment wasn't always money. Sometimes it was a bottle of vodka, a bag of flour, or a favor owed. Barter was the heartbeat of survival. A family with access to a dacha, a small garden plot outside the city, might grow extra potatoes, cucumbers, or cabbages. These could be exchanged for sugar, meat, or even small luxuries. A man who knew how to repair radios or fix shoes could trade his services for food. Women who worked in factories sometimes smuggled home scraps of cloth, which could be turned into clothes for children. Nothing was wasted. Everything had a potential second life. Urban families often envied their rural relatives. Villages had their own hardships, but land meant the possibility of growing food. A sack of potatoes from a countryside cousin could make the difference between hunger and survival during the winter. Visits to relatives were often timed with harvest seasons, and returning to the city with bags of produce was a quiet but common ritual. For many, the link between city and countryside was not just cultural but essential. Without it, shortages would have been unbearable. The dacha, though humble, became a lifeline. Families spent weekends digging, planting, watering, and harvesting. Children were put to work carrying buckets, pulling weeds, and collecting berries. It was hard labor, but it carried a sense of control in a system that allowed little autonomy. A pantry stocked with jars of pickled cucumbers, sauerkraut, and jam was more than food. It was security, insurance against the state's failures. In winter, opening those jars was like opening bottled fragments of summer, flavors that cut through the monotony of grey bread and cabbage soup. Clothing was another arena of improvisation. Store-bought garments were rare, often poorly made, and identical across the population. Mothers became tailors, patching, darning, and resewing clothes to extend their lives. Sweaters were unraveled so the yarn could be reused. Children wore hand-me-downs from older siblings, cousins, or even neighbors. A boy's jacket might pass through half a dozen children before being retired into rags. Shoes were resold, patched with cardboard, or stuffed with newspaper when they became too loose. The idea of fashion was shaped less by choice than by resourcefulness. In the midst of scarcity, personal connections, blood were as valuable as money. A relative who worked in a butcher shop might set aside a piece of meat. A friend in a clothing factory could slip out a better quality coat. A neighbor who drove a delivery truck might know when sugar or butter would arrive at a store. Families carefully cultivated these relationships, sometimes with genuine warmth, sometimes with quiet calculation. In a society where official distribution often failed, blood created unofficial pathways to survival. This network extended even into medicine. While the Soviet system prided itself on universal healthcare, shortages meant hospitals and clinics often lacked basic supplies. Syringes were reused, antibiotics were scarce, and waiting lists for procedures stretched on endlessly. A parent with a sick child might rely on a friend to get medicine faster, or turn to the black market for drugs smuggled in from abroad. Grandmothers, too, carried their own traditions, herbal remedies, poultices, and home cures passed down for generations, blending with modern medicine to fill the gaps left by shortages. The hidden economy shaped not only survival, but also morality. Families lived with a dual sense of pride and guilt-pride in their ability to provide. Guilt in knowing they were bending the rules of a system that demanded loyalty. Parents taught children not to ask too many questions. They explained that this is how things are done, and children grew up understanding that navigating shortages required quiet cleverness. The skill of knowing who to ask, when to ask, and what to offer in return was as important as any subject taught in school. Still, resilience was not only material. Families clung to small rituals of joy. A mother baking a cake for a birthday might substitute ingredients, using mashed carrots or beets to sweeten when sugar was scarce. A father might find a way to bring home a rare treat, perhaps citrus fruit during winter, its fragrance filling the whole room with luxury. Families gathered around radios for music and news, or around televisions when they became more common, watching carefully curated programs but enjoying the shared experience nonetheless. Evenings might include reading aloud, singing folk songs, or simply telling stories. These were the moments that gave weight to endurance. And in all this, love was never absent. Parents sacrificed quietly, taking smaller portions at meals so children could eat more. Mothers stitched late into the night by dim light, turning scraps into something wearable. Fathers rose early, trudged to factories, returned late, and still lifted their children onto their shoulders in courtyards. Grandparents told stories, tended gardens, and filled in the gaps left by the state. Each act, however small, was a declaration that survival was possible not because of the system, but in spite of it. By the end of the day, when families finally gathered in their cramped apartments, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and rattling radiators, there was a fragile but undeniable sense of accomplishment. They had managed another day, stretched another loaf, found another solution. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, another queue, another shortage, another compromise. But tonight, they were together. And that, in its quiet way, was victory. For Soviet families, Work was more than a livelihood. It was the framework around which almost every aspect of life was organized. The state saw employment not simply as a way to earn wages, but as a tool of social control, a demonstration of loyalty, and even a measure of a citizen's worth. In a system where unemployment officially did not exist, everyone had a place in the great machinery of socialism, whether they wanted one or not. Factories were the backbone of Soviet industry, and countless families depended on their rhythms. The day began early, often with a trudge through snow or rain to reach a grey, concrete building looming against the skyline. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, oil, and the clatter of machinery. Work was repetitive, hours were long, and safety. Standards often slipped in the name of meeting production quotas. Yet despite the hardships, there was a peculiar pride in being part of this industrial drive. Propaganda posters painted workers as heroes, building the future brick by brick, bolt by bolt. But propaganda glossed over the reality. Quotas were not just goals, they were obligations. Failing to meet them could bring reprimands, demotions, or worse. Managers often demanded more than machines could produce, and workers compensated by cutting corners. Products rolled off the lines that sometimes broke, failed, or simply didn't work. Families joked in private about Soviet quality, a euphemism for goods that might fall apart after a single use. Yet no one laughed too loudly. Criticism, even in jest, could attract the wrong attention. Women played a central role in this. Labor system, Soviet ideology insisted on equality, and indeed, women worked in factories, offices, schools, and fields. They became engineers, teachers, and laborers, often doing the same grueling jobs as men. But equality at work rarely translated into equality at home. After long shifts, women still carried the burden of household labor, cooking meals, queuing for groceries, sewing clothes, and caring for children. The so-called double burden was a defining feature of Soviet family life, one that left many women exhausted but unacknowledged. On collective farms, the challenges were no less severe. Families tied to rural life rose before dawn, tending to livestock or trudging into fields that stretched to the horizon. Work was often backbreaking, with tools that seemed hardly modernized since the 19th century. Tractors were shared among many villages, and when they broke down, repairs might take weeks. Farmers had quotas, just like factory workers, delivering grain, meat, or milk to the state before keeping anything for themselves. Yet private garden, plots, small patches of land allowed to families became essential. It was from these tiny spaces that families grew vegetables, raised chickens, or kept pigs, often producing more food than the collective fields themselves. Children too were drawn into this cycle of labor. Teenagers worked summer brigades in the countryside, harvesting crops or assisting in state programs. Even younger children helped their families with daily survival tasks, gathering firewood, carrying water, or standing in queues. School education carried the rhetoric of socialist progress, but many children learned as much from their parents, whispered lessons in resourcefulness. They understood early that while the state promised abundance, it was family labor that made survival possible. Work also dictated mobility. Assignments from the state determined where families lived, sometimes sending them far from home to industrial towns, mining camps, or remote construction sites. Entire families relocated to Siberia, the Far East, or Central Asia, following fathers, or mothers assigned to new posts. These moves could be disruptive, tearing children from familiar schools and friends. but refusal was rarely an option. Families carried their lives in suitcases, adapting again and again to the state's demands. Despite hardship, moments of solidarity emerged within workplaces. In factories, workers developed quiet camaraderie, sharing tools, food, or small jokes to ease the grind. In rural villages, neighbors helped one another with harvests, barn repairs, or winter preparations. Even in the face of shortages, kindness circulated. A worker might smuggle home a piece of factory material to fix a neighbor's window, or a farmer might slip extra potatoes into another family's bag. In a system that pressed people down, these acts of generosity became a quiet rebellion. Yet, work was also a political stage. Every factory, every school, every farm had its party representative, responsible for enforcing ideological conformity. Meetings were frequent, speeches long, and loyalty demonstrations obligatory. Attendance was not optional. Workers were expected to applaud achievements, criticize the West, and reaffirm their commitment to socialism. Dissent, even silence, could be dangerous. Families understood that survival at work required not just labor, but performance. The careful act of saying what was expected, even if one thought otherwise in private. This constant performance seeped into family life. At the dinner table, parents weighed their words carefully, teaching children that what was said at home must never be repeated outside. It was not unusual for children to be told, "You mustn't talk about this at school." Loyalty could be rewarded. Suspicion could be disastrous. Families lived in a dual reality: the official world of work and ideology, and the private world of whispered truths and shared survival strategies. And yet, amid the weight of labor, there was also pride. A father might return from a shift covered in soot, but lift his child into the air, proud of his role as a provider. A mother might sew dresses late at night after a factory shift, proud that her daughter could wear something beautiful to school. Families clung to these small triumphs, moments when the harshness of the system was softened by love and resilience. By the end of the week, when wages were distributed often modest, sometimes delayed, families gathered to plan. The rubles were counted carefully, each earmarked for bread, utilities, clothing, or school supplies. Sometimes there was enough for a small indulgence, a toy for a child, a pair of shoes, or perhaps a rare cinema outing. These moments of choice, however small, were treasured. Reminders that life was more than labor, more than quotas, more than survival. The Soviet system tried to define people by their work, but families knew the truth. They were defined by each other. Work might dominate their days, but love, endurance, and quiet acts of defiance shaped their nights. In the tension between the demands of the state and the needs of the home, families found ways to hold on, not always happily, not always easily, but always with a determination that outlasted the factories, the fields, and even the system itself. Evenings in Soviet households carried a rhythm that echoed the day's labors. After long hours in the factory or fields, men and women alike returned home to apartments, often cramped and dimly lit, where family life unfolded in spaces that offered little privacy but immense resilience. Kitchens, especially, became the heart of survival. In communal apartments, where multiple families shared a flat, the kitchen was a contested space. Women jostled for burners on a stove, trading gossip or complaints in whispers, while the clatter of pots mingled with the smell of cabbage soup or boiled potatoes. Despite shortages, meals were stretched to feed everyone, and neighbors sometimes lent each other sugar, flour, or sunflower oil when supplies ran thin. It was in these modest kitchens that families carved out moments of warmth, even as the outside world demanded endless labor and loyalty. Children played their part in these evening rituals. They helped peel vegetables, fetched water, or simply studied at the table while their parents prepared food. Their textbooks, emblazoned with images of heroic workers and soldiers, taught lessons that praised the state's accomplishments. But the reality children saw in their own homes often painted a more complex picture. They noticed the fatigue in their mother's eyes, the quiet worry in their father's faces when discussing wages, and the frustration when a promised delivery of goods never arrived. Education shaped their minds towards socialist ideals, yet their family life quietly schooled them in endurance and adaptation. For families in rural areas, evenings looked different but carried the same undertone of struggle. After days spent in the fields or tending animals, villagers gathered around small tables in wooden cottages. Oil lamps or weak electric bulbs illuminated rooms where grandparents told stories. Mothers mended clothes, and fathers smoked in silence after laboring. For the collective, in many homes, food came more from their private garden patches than the state farm. A few chickens scratching outside or a cow tied to a post might be the difference between hunger and survival. Families knew how to preserve vegetables for winter, how to stretch bread, and how to turn scraps into meals. Their resourcefulness was a kind of quiet knowledge passed from generation to generation, an inheritance that proved as important as land or tools. Work defined not only the day but also relationships within families. Women, despite carrying equal or greater burdens, were expected to remain the steady backbone of the home. They woke first to prepare children for school, worked full shifts at factories or collective farms, then returned to cook, clean, and sew. Their hands bore the marks of both industrial labor and domestic chores. Men carried their own weight, often assigned to the harshest factory jobs, mines, or construction projects. Some drowned their exhaustion in vodka, a common escape that both numbed the hardships and strained households further. Arguments, stress, and financial anxieties sometimes erupted in these confined spaces. Yet families often found a way back to one another through necessity, love, or simple habit. Children grew into this dual reality of ideology and truth. In schools, they were celebrated for joining youth organizations like the Young Pioneers, wearing red neckerchiefs and saluting proudly during parades. At home, however, they might be tasked with queuing for hours to buy bread or watching siblings, while parents worked late. For many, childhood ended early, replaced by the responsibilities of contributing to family survival. Their loyalty to the state was expected, but their loyalty to family was instinctive, shaped by the sacrifices they saw each day. Even leisure was tied to work. Factories organized social clubs, choirs, or sports events to instill camaraderie and reinforce ideology. Families participated, partly because it offered rare recreation, partly because attendance was often noted. Cinema outings became special occasions, where families watched films portraying workers as heroes, peasants as devoted contributors, and the West as decadent and corrupt. While children might be inspired, adults often watched with quiet cynicism, their own lived experiences so far removed from the polished images on the screen. Still, for the price of a ticket, families could share a laugh or gasp together, momentarily transported from their daily burdens. Holidays, too, reflected the system's grip on life. Official celebrations, like May Day, or the October Revolution, parade filled city streets with banners, slogans, and marching workers. Participation was compulsory, yet families found joy in the spectacle, in the bright flags waving against the grey of daily life. Children clutched balloons, parents walked together in processions, and for a day, shortages and struggles were forgotten in a haze of music, speeches, and orchestrated enthusiasm. At home, private celebrations like birthdays or weddings revealed a different side of life. Families pooled resources to create feasts from limited supplies, sharing laughter, songs, and toasts long into the night. In these intimate gatherings, the cracks in the Soviet facade widened, revealing the true strength of community and kinship. The tension between work and home was constant, and families lived in a delicate balance. They could not ignore the demands of the state, yet they clung fiercely to their own identities, their bonds, and their private joys. In every loaf of bread stretched to feed more mouths, in every garment mended for another season, in every child tucked into bed despite shortages and fatigue, families carved out a life that was theirs, even under the shadow of state control. The Soviet Union tried to dictate the meaning of work and family, but within those small, resilient acts, families quietly wrote their own definition of survival. Housing in the Soviet Union was perhaps the most vivid battleground where family life clashed with state promises. Official slogans boasted of progress, of vast apartment blocks rising across the cities, of millions housed through socialist planning. But the reality for countless families was far from the glossy propaganda. For many, the word kommunalka, communal apartment, defined their existence. A single flat was divided among several families, each occupying a single room, sharing one kitchen, one bathroom, one corridor. Privacy was a luxury. Whispers carried through thin walls, and every domestic squabble or joy was laid bare for neighbors to hear. Imagine a young couple with 2 children living in a single 10 by 12 room. Beds lined the walls, a wardrobe held clothes for all, and a small table doubled as both dining surface and homework desk. The kitchen, down the hall, was crowded with stoves, labeled for each family, shelves filled with jars of pickled vegetables, and notes warning neighbors not to touch food that wasn't theirs. Bathrooms became battlegrounds over schedules, cleanliness, and noise. Quarrels were frequent over whose turn it was to clean, over someone hogging the stove, or even over children's footsteps echoing in thin-floored corridors. But within this tension, a strange camaraderie also grew. Neighbors often doubled as babysitters, allies, or even extended family. Children played together in the hallways while parents swapped stories, advice, or smuggled jokes about the government whispered in low voices. These apartments, for all their frustrations, became ecosystems of survival where bonds were forged. Under the pressure of cramped living, the state may have built the walls, but families and neighbors created the life inside them. Housing shortages also meant endless waiting lists. Families sometimes lived with in-laws or shared a single room for years before being granted their own apartment. For newlyweds, moving into a relative's flat was not just common but expected, leading to households where grandparents, parents, and children all slept under one roof. This multi-generational setup created its own conflicts, arguments over parenting styles, frictions between tired mothers-in-law and young wives, or fathers struggling to assert authority in spaces already dominated by elders. Still, it also preserved traditions, ensured children were always supervised, and bound families together in ways both challenging and supportive. The constant lack of space, however, took a psychological toll. Adults craved quiet moments, but solitude was nearly impossible. A father might retreat to the stairwell to smoke in peace, or a mother might sit by the window long after everyone else had gone to bed, gazing at the courtyard below for a taste of silence. Children carved out imaginary worlds in corners, under tables, or in stairwells where they could dream beyond the walls. These small escapes helped families endure, but they also revealed how heavy the invisible weight of confinement was. In rural areas, housing looked different but carried equal challenges. Wooden cottages creaked under harsh winters, with drafty walls, leaky roofs, and stoves that demanded constant tending to keep the bitter cold at bay. Families often huddled together at night, layering quilts and blankets, listening to the wind batter the windows, smoke from the stove-filled rooms, mingling with the smell of dried fish, cabbage, or pickles stored for winter. Here too, space was scarce, and livestock might even share the dwelling, separated only by wooden partitions. But unlike city dwellers, rural families had one advantage: the land. A small patch of earth outside their homes gave them more control over their survival than queues in state shops ever could. These physical hardships were not just practical concerns, but shaped how families understood themselves. Home was not a private refuge, but a contested, shared environment. Children grew up understanding that space had to be negotiated, meals had to be shared, and silence was rare. Families learned patience, endurance, and resilience, but they also carried scars of stress, conflict, and unfulfilled desires for privacy. The emotional toll deepened as families absorbed the constant uncertainty of Soviet life. Scarcity was not just about bread or meat, but about stability. Parents worried about what tomorrow might bring. Would the factory cut wages? Would the shop have flour? Would they be denounced for a careless word? This uncertainty bred caution, teaching families to keep their complaints behind closed doors, to trust only within their circle, to speak carefully even among neighbors. Children learned early to recognize what could and could not be said outside the home. This silent self-censorship was as much a survival skill as finding food or keeping warm. And yet, families also cultivated hope in these spaces. They celebrated small victories, a new apartment, even if cramped, a rare treat from the store, a child excelling in school. They found joy in the laughter of children chasing one another down corridors, in the comfort of a hot meal on a bitter winter night, in the communal singing that sometimes broke out during holidays. For every frustration, there was resilience, and for every moment of scarcity, there was creativity. These families, living under the strict gaze of the state and the heavy hand of daily struggle, still built lives full of meaning, strength, and love. Every family in the Soviet Union shared a common ritual: waiting in line. Long, winding queues outside bakeries, butcher shops, and clothing stores became a symbol of daily life. Women often rose before dawn to secure a place, wrapping themselves in shawls and coats against the bitter cold. A scrap of paper might be passed around to keep track of the order, while neighbors chatted, gossiped, or traded tips about which shops were rumored to have received deliveries. Sometimes the wait ended with success: a loaf of rye bread, a bit of butter, perhaps some sugar. Other times, after hours in line, the shelves would be bare. The goods sold out long before everyone's turn came. Scarcity was not an exception. It was a permanent feature. Meat, fruit, sugar, even shoes or soap could be difficult to find. Families developed routines to cope. They preserved vegetables in jars during harvest season, salted fish, dried mushrooms, and pickled cabbage to stretch supplies through the harsh winters. Grandmothers kept careful watch over storage cellars, where glass jars gleamed with what little abundance could be secured. Even a single orange, bought as a treat for a child, was treasured as if it were gold. But shortages created more than inconvenience. They opened the door to what was known as blatt, the system of connections, favors, and informal exchanges that helped families get by. If you had a cousin who worked in a bakery, perhaps he could sneak you extra loaves. A friend in a clothing factory might set aside shoes. A neighbor who managed a warehouse might tip you off when flour was coming in. In a world where official promises failed to fill shelves, personal networks became lifelines. Families leaned on each other not just for emotional support, but for practical survival. Alongside blatt, the black market thrived. On street corners, or hidden in courtyards, people whispered about goods for sale. American cigarettes, French perfume, a pair of nylon stockings. Families who had a little extra to sell, perhaps surplus vegetables from a garden or homemade vodka, could barter for things otherwise impossible to obtain. It was risky. Authorities could punish those caught trading outside state channels, but it was often the only way to get essentials. A child might go to school wearing a coat bought from a shadowy deal, or a father might light a cigarette rolled from tobacco traded in secret. Ingenuity was constant. Clothes were patched and repatched until fabric wore thin, socks darned again, and again, shoes stuffed with paper when soles cracked. Toys were carved from wood, dolls sewn from scraps of cloth. Families grew accustomed to making do, to stretching every resource, to recycling and reusing until nothing remained. A broken chair was repaired, a cracked pot patched with wire, a sweater unraveled for yarn to knit anew. Creativity became as valuable as money, yet this system of survival weighed heavily. Parents carried guilt when their children asked for things they could not provide. A bar of chocolate, a pair of shoes that fit, a birthday cake. Fathers and mothers sacrificed their own meals to feed their children, cut their portions so the youngest could have more, or stood in freezing winds for hours, just to secure a kilogram of potatoes. These sacrifices became acts of love, quiet, unseen, yet deeply powerful. Children, too, learned resilience early. They stood in lines, carried bags of flour, helped tend gardens, or collected scraps of wood for fuel. They knew not to waste, not to complain, not to expect abundance. In some ways, they grew strong, adaptable, and patient. But they also learned caution, the fear of asking for too much, the acceptance of disappointment, the quiet ache of wanting what others had. Holidays offered brief reprieves. New Year's, the grand Soviet celebration, often meant sweets, tangerines, and small gifts. Families saved and scrimped all year for this one occasion, when the children could taste treats and the home glowed with warmth. For a short time, scarcity lifted, and joy replaced want. But once the celebrations ended, reality returned, and families once again faced the daily grind of queues, rationing, and making do. The story of shortages was not simply about hunger or lack of goods. It was about resilience, about how families turned deprivation into survival. It shaped their values, thrift, patience, solidarity. It tested their limits with frustration, fatigue, and longing. And it revealed time and again how ordinary. People endured a system that promised abundance but delivered little. Every Soviet family was bound, in some way, to the demands of labor. For adults, whether they lived in a bustling city or a small rural settlement, work was not just an occupation but an obligation. The state called it a duty, a contribution, to the great collective project of socialism. Yet behind the slogans of productivity and progress, ordinary men and women carried heavy burdens in the cities. Factories roared with sound, the hammering of metal, the grinding of gears, the hiss of steam. Men and women stood shoulder to shoulder at assembly lines, producing tractors, textiles, or military equipment. The pace was grueling, often unsafe, and mistakes could mean injury or harsh discipline. Managers pressured workers to meet quotas, pushing them to exhaustion. Families depended on these wages, meager though they were, so workers endured long hours under strict eyes. Rural life carried its own trials. On the collective farms, families toiled in the fields from dawn until dusk, harvesting wheat, tending livestock, and hauling water filled their days, leaving little time for rest. Children often joined in the labor, carrying bundles of hay or chasing stray animals. The promise of collective farming was equality and shared prosperity, but the reality was endless effort for meager returns. Families sometimes received payment, not in money but in grain or small shares of produce, barely enough to sustain them. The expectation of dual responsibility weighed heavily on women. Many mothers worked full shifts in factories or offices, and then returned home to face their second shift, cooking, cleaning, washing clothes by hand, and caring for children. Kitchens were small, often shared by multiple families, and appliances were scarce. A simple meal might take hours to prepare, from peeling potatoes to hauling water. Yet women were expected to manage it all, to hold households together while fulfilling the demands of labor outside. Workplaces were not just sites of labor, but also of surveillance. Walls carried slogans proclaiming loyalty to the state. Meetings reinforced political ideology, reminding workers of their duty to the party. Falling behind in quotas, complaining about conditions, or skipping meetings could bring suspicion. Whispers of disloyalty sometimes spread faster than gossip, and families learned to measure their words, even at work. Fathers and mothers carried this caution home, teaching children not to repeat private conversations in public. And yet, within the grind of labor, families sought pride. A father who brought home extra bread from a factory canteen. A mother who managed to stretch her salary to buy a new coat for her child. A young man praised in a factory bulletin for exceeding production targets. These small triumphs carried meaning. Work was not only survival, but also identity. Families, despite exhaustion, clung to dignity through their labor. Children grew up seeing this rhythm, absorbing its lessons early. Many teenagers left school to help earn wages or contribute to farm work. They understood that their family's well-being depended on sacrifice. Work was not a choice, but a necessity, shaping not only family life, but personal dreams. Some aspired to study, to escape the factory floor. But many resigned themselves to repeating the cycle their parents endured. Behind the statistics and slogans, the human story of Soviet labor was not about records broken or quotas met. It was about tired bodies trudging home after long days, about families stretching thin wages to cover rent and food, about mothers balancing endless duties with quiet resilience. It was about survival. Survival not in the sense of dramatic struggle, but in the daily grind of ordinary lives. In the Soviet Union, work was more than a paycheck. It was the key to survival in almost every other part of life. Housing, for instance, was not secured through a private market as in the West, but through the workplace. Families relied on their jobs to provide them with apartments, which were distributed according to the needs of workers and the decisions of bureaucrats. This system bound families to their employment in a profound way. A factory worker in a large city might wait years on a housing list, hoping for a room in a communal apartment. These rooms were small, often barely large enough to fit a bed, a table, and a wardrobe. Several families shared a single corridor lined with doors, with a communal kitchen and 1 or 2 toilets for everyone. Privacy was almost non-existent. Tensions brewed over kitchen schedules, cleanliness, and the noise of crying babies. Yet for many families, even this cramped arrangement was a step up from earlier barracks or rural huts. Those who worked in key industries or held positions with higher status could sometimes secure larger apartments or even a separate flat. A job in a prestigious factory, an academic institute, or a government office could mean better living conditions. For families, this was a prize worth striving for, but it also created quiet hierarchies between neighbors. The location of one's work shaped where and how one lived, influencing children's schooling and the family's entire daily routine. Workplace culture itself was deeply colored by ideology. Each factory or office was not only a place of production, but also a hub of Soviet social life. There were meetings in which workers gathered to discuss political directives, elections in which party-approved candidates were unanimously supported, and cultural events organized to celebrate Soviet holidays. Families felt this presence even outside the workplace. A father might bring home stories of a rally at the factory, while a mother might involve her children in parades organized by her office union. For children, the workplace shaped futures even before they entered it. Schools prepared them to become good workers and loyal citizens. The emphasis was on practical skills, discipline, and ideological education. Older children were often sent to factories or farms during school holidays to help with production, reinforcing the sense that work was central to life. Some teenagers were offered apprenticeships tied to factories, giving them a direct path into jobs that would later provide housing and security. The connection between labor and opportunity was both empowering and limiting. On one hand, a diligent worker could hope to improve their family's life, securing a better apartment, obtaining access to slightly more goods, or earning respect within the local community. On the other hand, it left little room for choice or individuality. Families were locked into a system where personal freedom mattered less than collective duty. Changing jobs could mean losing housing, and criticizing conditions could endanger not just an individual, but their entire household. And yet, within these structures, families sought joy. They decorated their small apartments with photographs, homemade curtains, or colorful rugs brought from rural relatives. They celebrated workplace bonuses with small feasts, stretching food and vodka across a crowded kitchen table. A child's success in school or an adult's recognition at work could light up a family with pride, though the state loomed large. The intimacy of these everyday victories gave families the strength to endure. The cycle of labor, housing, and generational hope became the foundation of Soviet family life. Parents taught their children the value of hard work not merely as virtue but as survival. The walls of factories and the fields of farms became backdrops to childhood memories, family struggles, and small triumphs. Work was not just a part of life in the Soviet Union. It was the thread that bound together every part of existence. Factories, fields, and offices in the Soviet Union were not simply places of labor. They were also sites of risk and hardship that weighed heavily on families. The ideology of production at any cost often meant that safety, health, and personal well-being came second to quotas. In factories, machinery was old and often poorly maintained. Workers, including young apprentices, labored around sharp gears, heavy presses, and dangerous chemicals with minimal protective equipment. Accidents were frequent. A hand caught in machinery, a slip on an oily floor, or exposure to toxic fumes could change a family's life in an instant. The loss of a breadwinner meant not just sorrow, but the sudden threat of losing housing or falling into poverty. On collective farms, the hazards were different but equally severe. Families worked long hours in fields under the hot sun or the bitter cold, often with outdated tools. Horses and oxen did much of the heavy hauling, but much of the planting and harvesting was still back-breaking manual labor. During harvest season, children were often brought along, expected to help glean crops or carry bundles of hay. Injuries from farm equipment, exhaustion, or untreated illness were common, yet rarely talked about outside the village. Despite these conditions, the state projected an entirely different image. Posters, films, and radio broadcasts painted labor as heroic. Brightly colored propaganda showed smiling workers, sleeves rolled up, producing steel or wheat for the glory of socialism. Children grew up with stories of the shock workers who surpassed quotas and were rewarded with medals, better rations, or even a small apartment upgrade. To the state, labor was a triumph. To the families who lived it, it was both pride and suffering. The constant push to meet production goals meant that time at home was often shortened or filled with exhaustion. Fathers returned from the factory late, their hands stained with oil, too tired to do much more than eat and collapse into bed. Mothers who worked double shifts at textile plants came home to long lines at bread shops, cooking for the family and keeping the household together. Children sometimes raised younger siblings while their parents worked, learning responsibility early but losing much of their childhood play. Health inevitably declined under this system. Long hours, poor nutrition, and polluted environments took their toll. Cities filled with smoke from coal-burning plants, chemical runoff seeped into rivers, and overcrowded housing spread illness. Tuberculosis, respiratory diseases, and workplace injuries were persistent issues. Families often lacked access to sufficient medical care, and while treatment was technically free, supplies were limited and hospitals were overcrowded. Apparent illness could stretch a household to the breaking point, and yet resilience was everywhere. Families developed quiet rituals of care to sustain one another. A grandmother might brew herbal teas when official medicine was absent. Neighbors helped each other by sharing soup, mending clothes, or taking in children while parents worked. Women carried much of this invisible labor, holding families together with determination and endurance. Even within hardship, moments of laughter and bonding found a way to shine through. A father telling jokes at the dinner table despite his exhaustion, a child running through the apartment corridors playing chase, or neighbors gathering in the communal kitchen to share stories. These small moments gave families strength. They were not the smiling figures of Soviet posters, but they were real, human, and enduring. For many families, survival was not just about laboring in the fields or factories, but about resisting despair. They built resilience through community, through traditions, and through the shared hope that tomorrow might be just a little better. Work took so much, but families gave each other the courage to endure. The Soviet family lived not only with the hardships of labor, shortages, and housing struggles, but also with the quiet resilience passed down through generations. At the heart of every home was the effort to maintain bonds in spite of overwhelming pressures. This was the invisible strength that allowed families to endure. One of the most powerful ways families survived was through tradition. Even as the state tried to reshape culture and erase older customs, families quietly kept them alive. In rural villages, grandmothers taught children the old songs, lullabies, and stories that stretched back centuries, folk tales told in hushed voices around the stove reminded children of values beyond quotas and slogans. They carried lessons about kindness, cleverness, and survival. These tales connected families to a heritage that the official Soviet narrative often tried to silence. Meals, however modest, became rituals of togetherness. A pot of thin cabbage soup or kasha, shared among all, was more than sustenance. It was an act of unity. Even if the bread was stale and the tea weak, families made space to sit together, talk, and preserve a sense of normalcy. The meal might be punctuated with laughter, jokes, or debates about politics, whispered carefully in fear of listening ears. The act of eating together helped them remember they were not just laborers or cogs in a vast state machine, but parents, children, and kin bound by loyalty to one another. Generational lessons also carried resilience forward. Children grew up, watching their parents navigate endless shortages with resourcefulness. A mother could patch a coat until it seemed to last forever. A father might repurpose scraps from the factory into tools for home. These acts of ingenuity were silent lessons, teaching children that survival required creativity as much as strength. Families developed unwritten codes of endurance. Never waste, always share, hide what is precious, and trust those who have proven themselves. Religious traditions survived too, though often hidden. The Soviet Union was officially atheist, and churches were demolished or converted into warehouses and museums. But in private, many families still lit candles for Easter or whispered prayers before bed. A grandmother might keep an icon hidden behind a cupboard door, pulling it out in secret moments. Children learned early the importance of silence and discretion. Faith was not just spiritual, it was an act of resistance. These quiet rituals carried immense meaning, binding generations through a shared sense of hope that there was more to life than the hardships dictated by the state. Celebrations, however small, also reinforced family unity. Birthdays were not always lavish, but even a single cake, baked with great effort, became a feast. Soviet holidays, like May Day or Victory Day, offered opportunities for families to gather and share what little they had. Some would trade ration, coupons with neighbors to make a slightly better meal. Others stitched together makeshift gifts. Children learned joy not from abundance, but from the effort their families put into marking these moments. For all the strength families showed, there was also an unspoken weariness passed down. Parents often told their children to keep your head down, a lesson born from years of navigating suspicion and scarcity. Families taught resilience, but they also taught caution. A wrong word could cost a job, or worse, bring the attention of the state. Trust was precious, guarded carefully, shared only with those closest. Within the family walls, there could be honesty and laughter. Beyond them, caution and restraint ruled. What kept families together, above all, was the knowledge that they were each other's only certainty in an uncertain world. The Soviet system demanded endless sacrifice, but within homes, parents and children built a refuge where stories, traditions, and love endured. The bonds of kinship offered what the state could not: humanity, dignity, and the promise that no matter how difficult life became, they would face it together by the close of each long day. When fathers returned from factories, mothers from offices or fields, and children from schools, there was at least the comfort of togetherness. Even when meals were sparse and conversations whispered, even when apartments were cramped and futures uncertain, the simple act of sharing a space, a story, or a laugh reminded families why they endured. Survival was not just measured in rations or rubles, but in the ability of families to hold one another through the storms of scarcity, labor, and repression. The state may have built walls, but inside those walls, families built resilience. As the years of the Soviet Union dragged on, the struggle of families was not limited to the physical burdens of food shortages, cramped apartments, and endless queues. There was also a heavy weight of ideology pressing down upon everyday life. Families were expected not only to survive, but to mold themselves into model Soviet citizens, loyal to the party above all else. This expectation seeped into every corner of domestic existence. At school, children were taught to revere the state, memorize slogans, and report on unpatriotic behavior. Teachers praised those who denounced a classmate's wrong ideas. And in some cases, children even learned that informing on their own parents could be considered heroic. For families, this created a quiet, constant fear. Every word spoken at home could echo outside its walls. Parents measured their sentences, avoiding criticism of the government in front of their children, not because they doubted their love, but because they feared the innocent honesty of youth. The intrusion of ideology was not confined to the classroom. Public events, from parades to political meetings, required participation. Attendance was tracked and absences noticed. Families marched together with banners, waving flags, and chanting slogans, sometimes in genuine pride, often in weary obedience. Fathers and mothers wore carefully neutral expressions, never too enthusiastic to invite suspicion, never too indifferent to be labeled untrustworthy. Children absorbed this balancing act. Life was a performance, a theater in which survival depended on playing the right part. Even within the home, ideology entered through radio broadcasts, posters, and mandatory political literature. Families displayed portraits of Lenin or Stalin not as decoration, but as shields, proof of loyalty for any visitor who might question their dedication to the party. Children grew up under these stern gazes, internalizing the idea that the state was always watching. In such an atmosphere, trust within the family became both vital and fragile. Parents whispered their truest thoughts only after checking windows and doors, and children learned to read between the lines of what was spoken aloud. The impact of censorship weighed heavily as well. Newspapers and broadcasts painted a glowing picture of Soviet life: factories booming, farms bountiful, progress unstoppable. Yet families experienced something entirely different: long hours of labor, empty store shelves, and the gnawing hunger of unmet needs. The gap between propaganda and reality created a strange dissonance. Around the kitchen table, families shared the truth: how difficult it had been to find bread that day, or how a neighbor's cousin had been arrested for speaking out. But in public, they smiled, nodded, and repeated the official lines. It was a double existence, one outward and one inward, and it exhausted the spirit. For children, this duality shaped their very sense of the world. At school, they wrote essays about the greatness of the Soviet Union, while at home, they watched their parents barter, scavenge, and worry over survival. They learnt to compartmentalize, to hold two truths at once, the one demanded by the state, and the one lived within their own four walls. Some carried resentment, questioning the hypocrisy. Others grew numb, convinced that silence and obedience were the only paths to safety. Despite these pressures, families developed subtle ways to resist. Humor became a quiet form of rebellion. Jokes about leaders, whispered in kitchens, provided relief, though they carried risk. Satirical remarks, passed among trusted friends or relatives, reminded families that they still held the power to think independently, even if they could not speak openly. Laughter, dangerous as it was, served as a reminder of humanity's stubborn refusal to be entirely crushed by ideology. Religion, too, continued as a hidden counterpoint to the state's demands. Families celebrated Easter or Christmas quietly behind drawn curtains. Children were told stories of saints in hushed tones, not to be repeated outside. These moments offered a sense of continuity, a link to ancestors who had lived long before the revolution. Even when the state sought to erase faith, families clung to it in private, passing down traditions as quietly as seeds planted in dry soil, waiting for the chance to grow again. In this way, Soviet families did more than endure ideology. They learned to live alongside it, bending when necessary, resisting when possible, and always guarding the fragile flame of truth within their homes. It was a life of constant adjustment, a delicate dance between loyalty and survival, between silence and expression, between fear and hope. The daily tension between private life and public expectation in the Soviet Union left families living in an almost permanent state of watchfulness. One of the most suffocating realities was the presence of the secret police, the NKVD. Time, later the KGB. Their shadow loomed over every neighborhood, every factory, every school. Families never knew who might be listening, who might be taking notes, or who might be quietly reporting them for even the smallest hint of disloyalty. Ordinary citizens understood that denunciations could come from anyone: a neighbor hoping to gain favor, a co-worker desperate to protect themselves, or even a family member torn between fear and loyalty. It created a culture of mistrust. In apartment blocks where walls were thin, conversations were held in whispers. Radios were turned up to drown out private talks. Children were warned with unusual seriousness: never repeat what you hear at home. Parents carried the knowledge that a careless word from their son or daughter, spoken innocently at school, might endanger the entire family. The possibility of an arrest was not abstract. It was a memory, a story passed down, sometimes a lived experience. Families told each other about the night knocks on the door, the sudden disappearance of neighbors, the empty chair at the dinner table after someone was taken away. Some returned years later from prison camps in Siberia, gaunt and broken, but many never came back at all. Children grew up with the unspoken lesson that survival required silence, obedience, and an outward show of loyalty. The uncertainty extended to work and livelihood. Families depended on jobs assigned by the state, but employment was not just about income. It was tied to one's reputation and political record. A worker labeled unreliable might lose not only their position, but also their families. Right to housing, rations, or educational opportunities for their children. This meant that fathers and mothers worked tirelessly to appear beyond reproach, attending every meeting, clapping at the right moments, repeating slogans with conviction. Behind closed doors, exhaustion and frustration spilled out, but in public, a mask was mandatory. Education was another place where families felt the weight of repression. Schools were not merely institutions of learning. They were engines of ideology. History was rewritten to serve the party's narrative, and children memorized, simplified, sanitized versions of the past. For families, it was painful to watch their children absorb propaganda, knowing that the stories told at school often contradicted the truth known at home. Yet correcting a child openly was dangerous. Parents learned to guide subtly, asking questions. Instead of giving answers, hinting at deeper truths without directly challenging what was taught. This careful dance of words shaped generations into people who could read between the lines, interpret silences, and understand that truth was often hidden. The pressure also fractured families in ways that could not always be repaired. In some heartbreaking cases, children were encouraged, even rewarded, for reporting the unpatriotic words of their parents. These betrayals, sometimes genuine, sometimes fabricated, left wounds that lasted for decades. Parents became cautious, not only around neighbors and colleagues, but sometimes even in front of their own children. For young people, this created confusion, guilt, and a divided loyalty that left scars well into adulthood. Still, amid all this repression, families discovered small acts of resistance that kept their spirits alive. Secret diaries were hidden under floorboards, letters passed quietly among relatives in rural villages, folk songs sung in hushed voices after the lights were out. These fragments of expression, though dangerous, preserved identity and individuality against the weight of enforced conformity. Every whispered joke, every hidden prayer, every unapproved song became a declaration. We are still ourselves, even here. The Soviet state sought to control not just actions but thoughts, to make every citizen into a loyal subject whose life revolved around the party. Yet families, in their kitchens, in their cramped apartments, in their whispered conversations, found ways to protect the essence of who they were. They lived with fear, yes, but they also lived with resilience, carrying forward hope that one day their children might inhabit a world where silence was not survival's price. Amid the heavy weight of surveillance, rationing, and fear, families in the Soviet Union clung to the things that gave life meaning beyond politics, traditions, culture, and community. For many, these were the quiet, unseen forms of resistance that allowed them to endure a system designed to strip individuality away. At the heart of this resilience was the family unit itself. Even though the state encouraged loyalty to the party above loyalty to kin, people still turned to family for comfort and protection. In cramped communal apartments, relatives often lived together across generations, grandparents, parents, and children all sharing the same few rooms. Privacy was scarce, yet in the quiet moments when doors could be shut and curtains drawn, these families exchanged stories, laughter, and memories that reminded them they were more than just workers and subjects. Food, even when scarce, became a way to preserve culture. A grandmother baking traditional bread in a village oven, a mother making soup from whatever scraps she could gather. These simple acts were infused with meaning. Families guarded recipes that had been passed down for centuries, even if they had to substitute ingredients or stretch meals to feed more mouths than the pot could reasonably hold. Preparing and sharing food became a ritual of togetherness, a reminder that they belonged to something older and stronger than the Soviet system. Religion, though officially suppressed, also quietly survived in many homes. Churches had been shuttered, priests imprisoned, and faith declared outdated superstition. Yet in kitchens and bedrooms, icons were hidden behind curtains or tucked into cupboards, and candles were lit for private prayers. Children grew up watching their elders cross themselves in secret or whisper blessings before meals. For families, faith provided strength, not in public ceremonies, but in whispered affirmations that offered hope against despair. Music, too, was an anchor. Official songs filled parades and propaganda broadcasts, but in homes, families kept alive their own traditions. Folk tunes, sung in hushed tones, carried centuries of history within them. A father might hum an old melody from his childhood while rocking his baby to sleep, or siblings might whisper lyrics late at night when the world outside was silent. These songs were not just entertainment, they were a connection to ancestors and a form of quiet defiance against a regime that wanted to erase the past. Community networks also played a role in survival. In villages, neighbors shared tools, helped rebuild bonds, and looked after one another's children. In cities, trusted friends exchanged small favors, an extra piece of bread, a smuggled book, or news from relatives living far away. These acts, though small, gave families a sense of belonging that the state could not provide. A whispered joke shared with a neighbor or a loaf of bread quietly handed over in a time of hunger meant more than grand slogans shouted at public rallies. Education, though steeped in ideology, also gave families hope for the future. Parents encouraged their children to study hard, not only because it improved their chances of advancement, but also because knowledge itself was a form of power. A child who learned to read widely might stumble upon hidden truths, might grow up to question, to think critically, and perhaps one day to see beyond the iron walls of propaganda. Families invested themselves in their children's futures, telling them that survival was not enough, that one day things might change. An education would prepare them to seize that opportunity. Even humor played its part. Soviet jokes, often whispered under breath, carried the sharp edge of truth disguised in laughter. Families would share them late at night, careful not to be overheard, and in that laughter found relief. The jokes mocked shortages, the absurdities of propaganda, or the hypocrisy of officials. For a few moments, they lightened the weight of oppression. Humor became survival, a release, valve against the constant tension of daily life. The resilience of these families was not grand or dramatic. It was found in ordinary acts, sharing a meal, telling a story, singing a song, lighting a hidden candle, exchanging a smile despite hardship. In these small rituals, families carved out a private world that the state could not fully control. They reminded themselves and their children that life had meaning beyond politics and struggle. They preserved identity, memory, and dignity, ensuring that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit endured. The story of family life in the Soviet Union is not one of simple tragedy or simple heroism. It is instead a story of contradiction, of deep hardship coexisting with extraordinary resilience, of fear pressed against the quiet strength of love. Families lived under a system that demanded loyalty to the state above all else. It pried into their homes, dictated their diets, controlled their words, and even sought to shape the dreams of their children. And yet, despite the suffocating presence of surveillance and scarcity, families found ways to protect something more valuable than ideology. The human spirit. It was not resistance, in the way history often celebrates. No great uprisings, dramatic rebellions. Instead, it was survival through the everyday. Mothers stretching a pot of soup to feed everyone. Fathers mending tools to make them last another year. Grandparents passing down stories of a past that could not be erased. These quiet, persistent acts were how families endured, reminding themselves that they belonged to something greater than any government, to each other. For the children raised in these households, the memory of whispered prayers, secret songs, or a shared loaf of bread left a legacy stronger than propaganda. It told them that while the state could try to dictate life, it could never truly own the bonds of family. In those bonds, they discovered strength, meaning, and continuity. And so, when we ask how families struggled to live in the Soviet Union, the answer is not only about hunger, ration cards, or fear of the knock at the door. It is also about how they clung to their identity, how they found laughter in the darkest times, how they held fast to love when so much else was stripped away. This is the enduring truth. Systems may rise and fall. Governments may demand loyalty, but the spirit of family is harder to extinguish than any ideology. The Soviet Union may have tried to shape every aspect of life, but in the kitchens, in the songs, in the stories, and in the hearts of its people, families kept alive something more powerful than politics. They kept alive the hope that someday, life would be more than survival. And in the end, that quiet hope was its own kind of victory.